This lecture is the final in our series for Chapter 10, and this one is the one we're going to be talking about urban land use. So this branches off a little bit from what we've been talking about, which has mainly been soil and agriculture. Well, we're going to be doing soil and agriculture, forests, public lands, things that are a little bit more typically viewed as environmental. So in this case, we're going to talk about the urban environment and how urban environments can be designed to be more sustainable. So let's get started here. First of all, urban environments typically have some negative impacts on the environment. Things we associate with urban environments are things like reduced biodiversity. We've moved in, the animals that typically would have lived there, whatever habitat was there, is gone. Usually urban environments have warmer temperatures than the surrounding area, so they're known as heat islands. So an island is a piece of land surrounded by water, but an urban environment is a heat island because it's an area that's warmer surrounded by an area that's colder, or typically cooler. Now, urban environments are warmer because, first of all, there's a lot of fossil fuels being burned, so the generation of electricity, there's natural gas in the homes, there's cars driving around, there's all kinds of machinery and industry operating in those urban environments that raises the temperature. And then secondly, we don't have the plants and the trees there in as great of numbers to lower the temperature or mitigate that effect. So as we talked about with our forests, the presence of trees helps reduce temperatures and moderate the climate because the trees provide shade, and the trees also perform transpiration where they allow water vapor to evaporate into the atmosphere. So that would lower the temperature. In the case of an urban environment, we don't have that, so we have much warmer temperatures, or the heat island effect. We have increased impervious surfaces. Remember, impervious means that it's impermeable to water, so water can't infiltrate down through those surfaces. You can see in the picture below there we've got parking lots, buildings, rooftops, streets, not a lot of area where groundwater recharge can happen. So because of our increased impervious surfaces, we also have increased runoff. All of that water that rains down that would normally soak into the ground is now running off to the sides, which would mean that we have the potential for flooding problems and things like that. So, first quiz question for you. All of the following are results of increased urbanization except, and you're going to choose the one that would be false in this list here. So, A, increased temperatures, B, decreased carbon dioxide emissions, C, decreased groundwater recharge area, D, increased runoff, or E, decreased biodiversity. So take a second to think about that, and if you're still thinking right now, pause it, because I'm going to tell you the correct answer, which is decreased carbon dioxide emissions. So B is going to be the false statement. All of the following are results of increased urbanization except decreased carbon dioxide emissions. This is because in urbanization we typically end up, like I said, burning more fossil fuels and cutting down forests. So both of those things would create increased carbon dioxide emissions, making B a false statement, which means it's our correct answer. So that means that A, C, D, and E are all true statements regarding urbanization, and it's important to take a look at those to make sure you understand what's going on. So with increased urbanization, we do see increased temperatures. We do see decreased groundwater recharge area because of those impermeable surfaces or impervious surfaces. We do see increased runoff, again because of those impervious surfaces. And we do have decreased biodiversity because we have basically just converted a whole bunch of habitat for animals into habitat for humans, and we require different, let's just say our habitat requirements are different. So let's talk about residential land use. One of the main things we do with urban areas is we have people live in them. So residential land use has been expanding in the United States since the 1950s. It's actually been expanding globally, but we'll focus at the United States for the moment. Currently, 2/3 of the U.S. population lives in suburban or exurban environments. Now, suburban is lower density residential that's near a city. Exurban is lower density residential that's not near a city. I don't think we have anything that's considered exurban in Southern California, or at least in the Los Angeles basin, because we all are very close to Los Angeles. But if we were to look at something like maybe the town of Carpinteria, Carpinteria would be lower density residential, not near a city. It's a small town, low density, it all looks more or less suburban. There's no big skyscrapers or anything like that. That would be exurban. So 2/3 of the U.S. population lives in one of these two environments currently. The result of this is that we have an increased need for transportation, which means we're using increased fossil fuels, which means we have increased air pollution. So our chosen style of living, living in these suburban type of habitat, if you might say, this has increased our use of fossil fuels and is degrading our air quality. We also tend to have larger houses than we used to have 50 years ago, which means that more land is being required per person to support our standard of living. So, I mean, I currently live in a 4-bedroom, I think it's about 1,500 square foot house. There are many 4-bedroom houses now that are 2,200 square feet. And they've got the extra large living room, the extra large kitchen. You know, they've got a much bigger backyard than I have. They may have a den in addition to their 4 bedrooms. So larger houses tend to require or end up requiring more land per person to live in them. Our increased use of land and the way that we're spreading out leads us to this thing called urban sprawl. Now the picture below there you can see is a great example of urban sprawl. We've got a lot of houses. They're spread out with big spaces in between them, large yards, nice grassy areas. It's a great place to live, but unfortunately for habitat, it means that we're requiring even more land than we should be. So urban sprawl, by definition, is the creation of urban areas that spread into rural areas and blur the lines between the two. So for example, this area in the picture may have been farm fields 30 years ago, but as the demand for suburban housing has increased, the farmers may have sold off their land to developers who then put in these big sprawling communities, which sort of spread out from the city center, increased commute times, increased fossil fuel use as people move towards those suburban areas. Cars and highways, however, make it very convenient for people to live in these suburban sprawled areas, which increases their demand. Nobody wants to live in the city center. It's noisy, it's loud, it's polluted. Why not live in the almost countryside of your suburban environment and then just commute into the city? Unfortunately, this puts a greater demand on the environment than we had understood 50 years ago. Living costs tend to be lower in the suburbs than in the cities, so that's another enticement for people to live there. And government policies have also encouraged suburban growth. The way the government has chosen to build highways, the way they've chosen to value or price the land, and the way that they have created incentives for people to move to these kinds of houses has encouraged suburban growth and encouraged urban sprawl. We realize now this has become a problem. There are very few cities that have done what Oregon has done, or Portland in Oregon has done, where they've actually made urban growth boundaries, and that would be a way of preventing sprawl. You basically draw a line on the land and say, this is as far as a city can go. All new development has to happen inside this line. And everything outside that line is going to be left as rural, it's going to be left as farmland, it's going to be protected as forest, it's going to be untouched. So maybe we'll use it for other things, but we're not going to build a city there. So that would be an example of a government policy that has discouraged urban sprawl. And personally, I think the effects are marvelous. You may disagree with me, but that's all right. So, quiz question. The creation of urban areas that expand into rural regions is known as A, habitat destruction, B, eutrophication, C, urban blight, or D, urban sprawl. And go ahead and think about the correct answer. There are 2 that may seem correct or 3 that may seem correct, but choose the best of those. The best answer, which in this case is D, urban sprawl. So yes, you might say that creating urban areas that expand into rural regions is an example of habitat destruction, but urban sprawl is the best term because that's actually the formal definition. If you have any questions, email me. Now, urban blight. What is urban blight? Urban blight is this nasty cycle that results in the degradation of the city center, making it an area where nobody really wants to live, and only the poorest of the poor are able to live there because they're the ones who can't afford to live anywhere else. And then all of the wealth moves outside of that urban area. So let's take a look at where this cycle starts, and we're going to start with the green arrow. Move my mouse pointer over there so you can see. We're going to start here with the green arrow. So the first step typically is that population shifts to the suburbs. Living in the city becomes undesirable. People move to the suburbs. As people move to the suburbs, the city budget starts to decline because they no longer have as many people living there, as many people shopping there. They're not making as much money. As the city budget in the city center declines, services are cut. Services like buses. That means that fewer customers are there, which means that businesses tend to leave. And as businesses tend to leave and vacate the area, the neighborhood tends to decline, which means that people don't want to live there anymore, so they begin to shift to the suburbs, which starts the cycle all over. Now, this degradation of the city center and the expansion of the suburbs is called urban blight. We saw in the Portland video how people in Portland were starting to turn that around. They actually took that area that was on the waterfront, and the city invested heavily in it. They renovated that area, and they created the Pearl District. The reason they were able to draw people back in and draw businesses back in is that, for example, they did not cut services. They built new trolley lines that were hard tracks in the street, which means that the city was not going to be changing where those lines went if businesses didn't come. The trolley lines were there, and the trolleys were going to stay there, and so the businesses had confidence that they could move into that area. Because of some of their other policies, which we'll talk about in a little bit, having to do with zoning, the people in the city of Portland were able to revitalize the Pearl District, make it somewhere people wanted to live, wanted to stay, which then prevented the loss of tax revenues. It prevented the need to cut services. It actually attracted businesses. And so instead of declining, the neighborhood actually became a very desirable place to live. And because they have urban growth boundaries that prevent expansion into the suburbs, they were able to keep their people in the city center. So Portland was able to stop urban blight. A lot of other cities haven't been able to and are fighting it right now. The transportation and the way that it works with urban sprawl. Sorry, the word sprawl got cut off there underneath. Let's start with increased gasoline tax revenues. So one of the interesting things that the government does is that for every gallon of gas that you buy, there's a tax on it. Money from that tax goes to highway construction, which sounds like a good thing. We need to have good roads. That's important. No one's going to argue with that. However, rather than necessarily repairing the roads we already have, the government has used those gasoline tax revenues to build new highways, which allow the suburbs to expand, which increases our traffic and congestion, which means that we have longer commutes, which means we need more gas, which means we have increased gasoline tax revenues, which starts this process again. So the way that the government has chosen to tax gasoline and then spend the money has actually contributed to urban sprawl. It's contributed to the expansion of the suburbs, to the expansion of highways, which has led to a lot of other issues, which we've started to discuss already. So zoning. How has the process of zoning contributed to urban sprawl? Well, basically, zoning is where the city decides that certain types of buildings can be built in certain areas. So for example, they might say that this one particular region over here has to be all residential. Another particular region over there, that can be commercial, like grocery stores or malls or strip malls or whatever. And then there'll be another area that has to be industrial. So the idea of zoning is to prevent people having to live next to industry, so we don't have an apartment next to a chemical factory, in theory. Well, unfortunately, the way that zoning has tended to work is that it has also separated people from retail locations. So commercial and residential can't be mixed. And that leads to a problem. It means that people have to, by definition, get into a car to drive to the store. So the idea of zoning is that it's intended to make cities more safe. Unfortunately, that's not always what happens. What a lot of cities are looking at now is something called multi-use zoning. Multi-use zoning allows these fantastic live-work communities. So basically what multi-use zoning allows is it says, hey, you can have a residential building here, and you can have the bottom of that residential building be shops, the top can be apartments or nice condos, and you can have it right next door to an office building. So we're still not going to allow it to be right next to the chemical plant because that would be unsafe. But we can mix office and residential. We can mix retail and residential so that we can create these communities where people can walk to work or take public transportation to work and won't have to use a car. They can walk to a restaurant they want to go to. They can walk to the grocery store. So these are the sorts of ways that zoning, multi-use zoning in particular, is allowing cities to change the way that they allow their citizens to move around and get from place to place. So, true or false, multi-use zoning can reduce urban sprawl. Think about it for a minute. Come up with your answer. And pause it if you don't know yet, because the correct answer is true. Multi-use zoning can reduce urban sprawl. So instead of having people spread out to the suburbs and use their cars, multi-use zoning allows us to build residential complexes right next to office buildings in the city center, keeping the people living and working and shopping all in one location, thereby reducing urban sprawl. Multi-use zoning, good thing for the environment. What are some other good things for the environment? Well, there's a whole movement called smart growth, and the smart growth movement basically says that we can grow our cities in a way that is sustainable and that protects land and that helps promote health and safety for the citizens who live there, as well as protect the environment. There are 10 principles to smart growth. I'm going to run through them really quickly. If you want more details, you can look in your textbook. First of all, mixed land uses. This is sort of the idea of multi-use zoning. We put our residential next to our commercial, next to our office buildings. All of it is mixed together so that people can live and work and play all in one area without needing to use their cars. We have a range of housing opportunities, meaning we have dedicated low-income housing and housing that may be more expensive. The purpose of having dedicated low-income housing is to prevent something called gentrification, which is where a particular area becomes so expensive that only the very wealthy can afford to live there, and anyone who's not that wealthy has to then use a car or public transportation of some kind to get there. So it prevents this elitist sort of neighborhood from forming and allows people of many different socioeconomic statuses and cultures to live and work and play in the same area together. So basically we don't have these extremely wealthy neighborhoods on one area versus extremely poor neighborhoods in another. It keeps everyone mixed up together, which most people would agree is a good thing. One of the tenets of smart growth is having walkable neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where you can get from place to place using public transportation and your own 2 feet. You don't need to drive. So if you take a look at the lower right-hand picture, you can see there's lots of shady sidewalks, public transportation access nearby. It's a very beautiful place to be. Another tenet of smart growth is having community and stakeholder collaboration. Means that whenever you have development in an area, you don't just make it exclusively the developers who are planning it out, or exclusively the citizens, or exclusively the city government. It's everybody who's involved, everyone who's going to be in that area gets to help have a say in what's happening. Finally, compact building design. This is a little bit controversial, but one of the tenets of smart growth is that people don't need as much space as we are accustomed to having. We can get by with less, we can have smaller buildings, we can fit more buildings into a particular space. So if you take a look at the bottom left-hand picture, you can see that there are 5 different buildings lined up in that block right there, 5 different stores, and presumably they have apartments on the 2nd floor where people are living. So having compact building design means we use our space more efficiently. Things are not sprawled out, and if we don't need to have as many parking spaces because people are taking public transportation, that allows us to fit more buildings in any given area. 5 more tenets of smart growth. Sense of place. This is one of the most interesting ones to think about. It's this idea that every community has a particular character. It has a vibe, it has a feel, so that when you're in that area, you can pick up on really what's important in that community. Is it artsy? Is it retro? Is it sort of cinematic? Is it a very safe, community-oriented neighborhood? Is it very organic and green? So there's a sense of place that develops around each neighborhood, and part of smart growth is really bringing that out, focusing on developing that, so that each neighborhood has its own character and its own special qualities that make it unique. A second part of smart growth is preserving open space. Like, actually, technically, this is number 7. Preserving open space, farmland, and natural beauty. If you look down at the left-hand picture, you can see an example of an urban growth boundary. It is literally that street running through almost the center of the picture. On the left-hand side of the street is the suburbs. On the right-hand side of the street is farmland. And this is a picture that's showing where that urban growth boundary exists. Those suburbs are never going to expand into that farmland. That farmland will always be farmland, the suburbs will be suburbs, and we will have preserved some open space, farmland, and natural beauty. You can see kind of the trees in the background there. Transit-oriented development is the 8th tenet of smart growth. This is development that is focused around mass transit and public transportation rather than the use of cars. So rather than developing an area and putting in huge parking lots, narrow sidewalks and big wide streets, we want to put in metro, light rail, buses, or subways, things like that. Second to last, developing existing communities, which is also known as infill. This would be the idea of taking that empty lot in your neighborhood and turning it into a residential area or turning it into a retail area, rather than looking outside the boundaries of the community or the city and building out there. So this is another way of preventing urban sprawl. We develop within the communities we have. We use abandoned buildings and repurpose them, or we take empty lots or brownfields, reclaim them, treat the land, clean it up, and build there, rather than allowing those areas to remain vacant and looking out to new land to develop. So infill is one of those really important parts of smart growth. Finally, is this idea of having streamlined approval for smart growth. So a lot of times city projects take months or years to be approved by the city or the state or the county, whoever's doing the approval process. And one thing that developers would love to see is that if a project can be demonstrated to be a smart growth project, it gets the fast track. So rather than having to wait for months or years for things to be approved, smart growth projects move quickly, they get approved quickly, and they can be built quickly. So if you have any other questions about smart growth, go take a look at your book. It's got some great details there that you can read about. And quiz question, I think it's the last quiz question for you. All of the following would be considered smart growth except one of them. So is it A, increasing the parking lot size and the space between buildings? B, improving pedestrian access? C, designing efficient mass transit systems? D, developing the character of an area? Or E, expanding using infill? So go ahead and pause it if you haven't decided on your answer yet. And I'm going to reveal the correct answer, which is A, increasing parking lot size and space between buildings. So everything else, B, C, D, and E, those are all good parts of smart growth, but A is not. Because in smart growth, we don't want bigger parking lots. We don't want increased space between buildings. We want to decrease the space between buildings and move things and make them more compact. So A is false, which means that A is our correct answer, oddly enough. And B is true. So improving pedestrian access, that's a great part of smart growth, more walkable communities. Designing efficient mass transit systems, that's tenet, I think, 7 or 8 of smart growth. Developing the character of an area, that's an example of sense of place. And then expanding using infill, also part of smart growth. B, C, D, and E are all great things, but A is wrong. We don't want to increase our parking lot size. We have too many parking lots already. So that would be why A is the correct answer. I think that's our last slide. If you have any questions, as always, email me or talk to me after class one of these days. Our exam is going to be the Thursday before we leave for Christmas break, which gives us just about 3 weeks to get all of this information downloaded and understood and integrated into our psyche. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you all in class.